So, hello. I'm happy to see quite a few faces that I do know on here, but for those who don't know me, I'm Abby Dorsey. Um, I retired after 25 years of Air Force service with a lot of time also in the joint and interagency communities, and I had zero expectations that I would end up in academia, but here I am, called to serve in a different way. And so not every veteran is looking for the same thing after service. Many people choose to move to DoD service or transition into industry, start businesses, or move into entirely new chapters. And those paths are valid and important. This concentration was created for a more specific group of veterans. Those of us, and I'm using the word veterans broadly, military veterans, but also veterans of service in other ways like first responders, emergency room personnel, peacekeeping operations forces, et cetera. I'll define that a little bit more later on. But it's those of us who sense that what we lived through, witnessed, or carried is meant to be directly integrated into the way we choose to continue to serve. And for many of us, service does not end cleanly. There can be a loss of identity, unresolved moral weight, grief, or trauma that doesn't simply disappear with a new job title. And at the same time, there's often a deep desire to just make sense of it all, not only for ourselves, but in a way that allows us to show up for others. And so this concentration is really designed for those veterans who want to do their own healing work seriously and ethically, and who feel called to become trusted space holders, peer leaders, and resources for others navigating similar terrain. And it's ultimately grounded in the idea of the wounded healer, the healer who tends to their own wholeness so that we can contribute to the healing of our communities, the healing of communities that have been shaped by service, loss, and moral complexity. And that's the kind of post-service leadership that this program is oriented towards. And so before we dive in, just to briefly outline how I'm planning to use our time today so that we can leave plenty of time at the end for questions and conversation. I'm going to keep it relatively high level. I'm going to try to hit the questions that have already come my way and not go too deep into my own story, the story of Sofia University, although that's available. I'll touch on the inception of this concentration with a brief origin story, overview of transpersonal psychology, because that's ultimately the degree you're earning if you come into this concentration. And I'm grateful to have Penny Lee here from our admissions office and Bridget McGowan, who is a fellow PhD student and graduate of the MATP program, to also add their perspectives on this. And then we'll situate how the master's program works as an educational container and how the veteran leadership concentration fits into that, how it's oriented. And we'll touch on some of the logistical and funding frameworks that tend to come up most often. And then Bridget can speak to how the master's program actually works day to day, since that's not the program I personally went through. And then I'm happy to answer detailed questions about how the concentration itself is structured and facilitated. And hopefully this gives you enough clarity to know whether this feels aligned for you, or if you're here not for your own interest, but because you're part of veterans communities, first responder communities. And I'm so grateful that you're here. And hopefully it's enough for you to carry some information back to those communities. All right. So again, throughout this program, we're going to use the term veteran broadly. In addition to military veterans, it includes those who have served in other high-stakes roles where responsibility, risk, and real human consequences are part of the work. And what connects these experiences is not the uniform or the title, but the depth of service and the lasting impact it can have on identity, ethics, and leadership. Service fundamentally reshapes how we relate to responsibility, authority, and consequence. These experiences don't just build skills, they shape identity, ethics, and meaning. And they continue to influence how leadership is embodied long after formal service ends. And as we transition out of formal service roles, many encounter significant identity shifts. These are natural responses to experiences that challenge moral frameworks, belonging, and one's very sense of self. And this concentration is designed for service-experienced leaders who may either be navigating those transitions themselves and/or They feel called to help others integrate lived experience into leadership that is ethical, relational, and purpose-driven. And we are approaching these challenges through a transpersonal leadership lens, supporting participants in transforming experience into wisdom and cultivating leadership grounded in presence, integrity, and relational accountability. And when we look at what already exists, I found that there are some very real gaps. Most programs that engage service experience tend to fall into one of two categories: clinical treatment on one hand, or generalized leadership theory on the other. And in many cases, service experience gets framed primarily as pathology to be treated, credentials to be converted, or skills that just need to be translated into civilian language. What often gets missed is the moral complexity, identity transition, and relational leadership capacity that come from having carried deep, real responsibility. And there are very few programs that hold those dimensions together in a rigorous academic setting without turning service into either a diagnosis or a resume exercise. And there was also a practical gap. I couldn't find a program designed to be both academically serious and structurally accessible without upending one's life. A program that allowed people to live where they choose, continue their lives, and still meaningfully use all of the education benefits they earned through service, more specifically referring to military veterans. And so this concentration was intentionally designed to meet both of those gaps at once: the conceptual gap around this type of post-service leadership and meaning, and the structural gap around access, flexibility, and benefits. And so now that we've talked a little bit about what this is and or who this is for and why it exists, I want to step back and name the academic lens that's holding it all, which is transpersonal psychology. And I want to start with Sofia University's definition, which is the academic frame you'll actually be studying within. Sofia University defines transpersonal psychology as the scientific study of the full range of human experience, which includes the pain of trauma and dysfunction on one hand, and the heights of creativity, intuition, and peak functioning on the other. What distinguishes transpersonal psychology from many other psychological frameworks is that it doesn't focus exclusively on what is broken or disordered. It includes those realities, but it also asks a different set of questions. So rather than starting from what's wrong that needs to be fixed, transpersonal psychology is often oriented towards questions like, what is intact? What is trying to emerge? What brings coherence, meaning, and wholeness back online? And in that sense, it's a psychology that is less pathologizing and more integrative. It creates space for suffering and for wisdom, for trauma and for resilience, for fragmentation and for restoration. And that orientation can be especially important for service-experienced individuals. What we're often seeking is a way to make meaning of our experience, to reconnect with purpose, and to relate to others from a place of integrity and presence. I like to describe it as honoring the shimmering plurality of pathways to wholeness, interconnectedness, and realization, grounding subjective experience in ecological wisdom, inner intelligence, and empirical inquiry. This is the lens with which I've designed this concentration, one that respects multiple pathways to healing and leadership, rather than prescribing a single model. And this concentration sits squarely within that transpersonal frame. It's not about fixing what's wrong, but about supporting pathways toward wholeness, alignment, and resonant forms of leadership and service. And let's now situate it within the broader degree. Ultimately, anyone who enrolls in this concentration is earning a master's degree in transpersonal psychology with a focused area of study. The MATP program is designed to study both the theories and practices of transpersonal psychology, and to apply that learning in a range of professional and community settings. It's not just abstract theory, and it's not clinical training. It sits in that integrative middle ground. And students choose a concentration to give their degree a clear applied focus. Veteran leadership is now one option. Others include leadership and transformative life coaching, creativity and innovation, and spiritual psychology. Veteran leadership, however, is the only concentration that needs to be selected at admission because of how it's structured. And at its core, the program is built around transformative learning. That means it's not just about acquiring information, but about shifts in awareness, perspective, and how one understands oneself in relationship to others and the world. The emphasis is on leadership and development, self-knowing, and professional consciousness. In other words, who you are becoming matters just as much as what you know. And that orientation is what makes this a particularly strong home for a concentration like veteran leadership. Put simply, this is a master's level degree in transpersonal psychology with an optional specialized veteran leadership concentration designed for those who want to continue serving through peer facilitation, meaning making, education, advocacy, and/or community-based leadership. This is not a therapy licensure program or a training course aimed at diagnosing or treating clients. I will pause there for just a moment in case there's any questions about transpersonal psychology writ large. All right, great. So I want to share a bit about how this concentration actually came into being because it directly shaped how it's designed. So the idea started when Dr. Stephen Gold, one of our administrative leads at Sofia, reached out to me about developing a master's degree specifically for veterans. Steve is not a veteran himself, but he has a long history of working with veterans in educational settings. And when he floated the idea, sorry? I think just someone had the mic on. When Steve floated the idea, I actually pushed back and I told him I thought fully separating veterans into their own standalone master's program would be a disservice. His concern was that civilians can't really understand the veteran experience. And my response was that part of our responsibility, especially in leadership and education, is to help bridge that divide and not reinforce it. So instead, I suggested creating a concentration within the broader master's program. That way, veterans and other service experienced students could focus on concepts that are deeply relevant to their lived experience, while still participating in the larger academic community and engaging along so many humans with such incredible rich experience sets of their own, different from the veteran or first responder experience. And at the same time, I was reflecting on my own experience in the PhD program. I had been looking for more in-person engagement beyond the fall seminar, which is an incredible 1 week in residence requirement every fall. And I discovered that Sofia already offered low residency options for some programs where the in-person requirement was just 3 days. And so I pursued an eco-psychology certificate, partly because I was genuinely interested in the subject, but also because taking the in-residence version allowed me to meet that in-residence requirement and qualify for the in-residence housing allowance. And so as Steve and I continued talking, I had this realization. What if we could design a concentration that was not only academically meaningful, but also intentionally structured to help veterans maximize their education benefits without requiring them to relocate or disrupt their lives? And from there, I started asking a more personal question. If I were designing a concentration that I actually wanted to take, what would it focus on? And for me, that answer wasn't clinical psychology. It was learning how to hold relational space. Because sometimes the deepest healing comes not from a therapist-client relationship, but from being compassionately witnessed, being heard, and being in community with people who can genuinely relate to your experience. There's a long history of this kind of peer-based healing, going back to the early recognition of PTSD after Vietnam, and continuing with so many of the retreats and veterans groups that exist here today. And also learning how to be an advocate for the veteran community with municipal government, leadership, working with VSOs, etc. And at the same time, I've been struck by how many veterans and first responders have never heard the term moral injury, or are unaware of the growing body of research in the US and internationally on psychedelic assisted therapies. And expanding awareness in these areas matters. It supports informed decision-making, broadens access to care, and has real implications for reducing suicide risk and other harmful behaviors among veterans, first responders, and others who have served in high-stakes roles. And so I threw together an initial concept and then shared it out with several veteran colleagues, some of whom are psychologists now, and some are simply people I deeply respect. Incorporated their feedback and developed a proposal that was ultimately accepted. And that's how we got to the concentration as it exists today. And so veteran leadership in a transpersonal context begins with self-leadership. It refers to those of us who are committed to ongoing self-awareness and to being in honest, compassionate relationship with our own history of trauma, moral complexity, and also recognizing the gifts that we each bring. And from that foundation, leadership becomes relational rather than directive. Transpersonal veteran leadership is not about leading through control or authority, but through presence, discernment, and the ability to remain grounded in relationship. Being able to speak from our own lived experience without claiming it as universal, and holding space for others without needing to fully understand or be understood. Situating individual experience within broader cultural, historical, and systemic contexts. And this form of leadership includes the capacity to remain present with complexity. It honors paradox, ambiguity, and difference, recognizing that meaning-making after service is rarely linear and very complex. And ultimately, transpersonal veteran leadership is oriented toward service without self-erasure. It supports leaders in contributing to the healing of individuals, communities, and systems, while remaining attentive to our own integrity, limits, and well-being, including attention to embodied cues, intuition, and inner intelligence, alongside cognitive insight. And so getting into the logistics, the concentration is structured across 2 years, minimum. And the first year consists of your core MATP courses and 4 foundational concentration courses. And if we have enough students that want to get started right away, we'll launch in the spring with the Veterans Journey. And the other potential entry point will be in the fall, starting with the psychedelic informed approaches in conjunction with fall seminar. The second year moves into application. Students will continue with core MACP courses and engage in 2 sequential practicum courses focused on peer facilitation and applied leadership in real-world contexts. The concentration culminates in a transpersonal integration paper or project with a leadership focus, where students will synthesize their academic learning, practicum experience, and personal development. And so the arc is intentional. Foundation first. Students are supported in integrating lived experience into forms of relationship and leadership that are relational, ethical, and grounded in continued service. And then I'll take a couple of minutes to talk about what the program actually feels like to be in, because it's not a traditional classroom experience, and it might not be for everyone. This is not a course where you sit in a room or log into a Zoom and an instructor talks at you while you're expected to absorb the right answers. The orientation is very different. This is a learning environment where we're learning with each other. You'll be engaging with readings, videos, podcasts, recorded lectures, and other materials, not because those materials represent the final word or the right answer, but because they give us something to engage with, question, and respond to. And part of the work is noticing what resonates for you, what doesn't, and what feels like it's missing altogether. Something may land deeply for one person and not at all for another. And that difference is actually part of the learning. The emphasis is on lived experience rather than rote theory. You're not being asked to simply summarize what you've learned. You're being invited to reflect on how the material affected you, what came up in your body, what memories, reactions, sensations, or questions surfaced, and how that connects to your own journey and leadership. Each week, most of the work is independent, with the exception of the immersion week. You'll spend time engaging with the materials for that week and then writing reflective posts. Not just, this is what I learned, but this is what I noticed. This is how I felt. Or this is the story that stirred for me. You'll also respond to your classmates, noticing what came up for you as you read their reflections and heard how they made meaning of the same material. There's not a heavy emphasis on any live class time week to week. There will maybe be one or two actual in-person Zooms outside of the immersion, and those will be optional. So it's primarily asynchronous by design to allow people to live anywhere and to engage with the program alongside the realities of life, work, and service. The in-person component comes through 3-day in-residence immersions. And for the entire MACP body, there is a longer 1-week seminar in the fall. The seminar and the immersions are held at our Costa Mesa, California campus, just south of Los Angeles. And immersion days will be long days, but I believe they're going to be really rich and genuinely enjoyable. This is where we get to practice storytelling, compassionate and embodied listening, relational presence. This is also where ideas get workshopped, connections deepen, and we really begin to form our community. And as the program progresses, students will take on more and more leadership within those immersion spaces. This isn't about the instructor being the guru. I'll be teaching some of the courses, but not all of them, and none of the instructors are meant to be the one who knows everything. Every student in this program will bring significant lived experience. The structure is designed to honor that, to create a container where that experience becomes part of the curriculum, and to support you in becoming leaders who can think critically, identify gaps in what currently exists, and help shape what becomes possible for veterans and other service experience communities moving forward. And because I've already fielded several questions around the possibility, I want to briefly address the potential for a dual concentration with the Transformative Life Coaching certification. This is not yet formally listed in our catalog, but our program chair has assured me that if there is sufficient interest, we can make it happen. Now, veteran leadership is the only concentration that begins in year 1 because of the low residency in-person component. And so coaching courses won't begin until the 2nd year, and there will be time for you to decide if you want to follow that path. Choosing a dual concentration will likely extend the overall length of the master's program. Instead of a 2-year trajectory, it may take closer to 3 years to complete, depending on your course load and individual pacing. This is entirely optional. The concentration stands on its own as a complete path. But for some students, coaching is a beautifully complementary skill set they want to develop alongside their leadership work. And Sofia University's program is formally accredited by the International Coaching Federation. And admissions can help you walk through what that might look like in practice if that's something you're considering. And there's also, you can do dual concentrations with the other concentrations that are offered as well, just things to keep in mind. But you'll have at least a year to decide. All right, money, since this is something that definitely impacts us all. So this is a high-level orientation of funding options because this is one of the most practical questions people are holding. And I want to be very clear, this is general information. This is not individual advising. I am no authority that can tell you what you do or don't get or qualify for. Admissions and the VA certifying official are the right people to walk through how this would apply to your specific situation. What I want to do here is simply make sure you know what kinds of options exist. And so most military veterans who pursue this program will likely do so using VA education benefits, most commonly the post 9/11 GI Bill. Military veterans with service-related disabilities may also be eligible to use VRNE, Chapter 31. The 9/11 Bill is Chapter 33. This depends on your individual circumstances and vocational goals. Also, foot stomp, I highly recommend retaining 1 month minimum of the 9/11 bill for your own use, even if you've transferred the majority to family members, because just having that 1 month of remaining eligibility will qualify you for the higher Chapter 33 BAH rate if you're instead using VRNE. And so a key design feature of this concentration is that low residency structure. Because of that requirement each quarter, students may qualify, should qualify for the in-residence housing allowance for that term, even if you're living elsewhere. I live in Costa Rica. And some students may choose to use federal graduate financial aid. And depending on eligibility, that can total around $16,000 per quarter. And for veterans who are rated 100% permanent and total, federal student loans may be eligible for a one-time discharge subject to federal rules. That is the way the legislation is currently written, and I can vouch for the truth of that. So I'm going to walk you through a real example using my own situation. This is not a promise or a model for anyone. It's simply to make the structure more concrete. I personally use my post 9/11 GI Bill to pay for my classes. Because the veteran leadership concentration includes an in-residence requirement each quarter, you will also qualify for what I've been doing with my eco-psychology courses, which unfortunately I will complete and will have to go to the online rate next year. But for now, I qualify for the in-residence housing allowance for the terms that I have an in-residence component. So for winter quarter 2026, the Costa Mesa, California housing allowance, which is for all of us, the E5 with dependents BAH rate, I'm single, but this is the rate I get, is $3,882 per month. And because our academic quarter is 10 weeks long, and there's 12 weeks and 3 months, the housing allowance is prorated. So that works out to about $970 a week, or roughly $9,700 for the quarter. Payments are made monthly. Individual deposits can look a little strange. They're not $970 per week, but they add up to that amount. Now, my out-of-pocket cost to attend the 3-day in-residence immersion that I've been going to for eco-psychology is around $1,200. That's for transportation, my flights from Costa Rica to Costa Mesa. It includes staying at a hotel nearby. I walk back and forth to school, and then Ubering from the airports. And so that comes out for me to about a little over $1,600. And so I end up with $8,000 of my BH left to apply to my actual housing and living expenses. And when I switch back over to the online only rate, I would only get about $3,000 total for the quarter, so a little under $1,000 a month. And I'm sharing this not to suggest that everyone's numbers will look the same, but to show that this program was intentionally designed so that veterans can realistically make it work financially and logistically without having to relocate or pause their lives. And again, admissions, the VA certifying officials, the financial aid.gov are the right places to go to find out what applies to your personal situation. All right, how to apply. So Sofia.edu is your home for everything. And I think someone has a hot mic. Just please note if that might be you. And then we, of course, have Penny Lee, who's on the call from the admissions office that can answer questions as well. Sofia.edu/admissions is where you can find the button if you want to actually apply. And that's where you would submit your transcripts, your letters of recommendation, and the other items listed there to apply to the program. And with that, I am going to stop sharing this. Well, I'll leave the screen up for just a moment longer if anyone's making notes. And then we will move into Q&A. And for that, we have Bridget for questions about the MATP program writ large. I can answer questions specific to the veteran leadership concentration, and Penny can answer admissions questions.